This is Under the Crossed Swords, a podcast series from Mosquito Nautica. In this episode, I read the unpublished biography of Sergeant Mick about his time in the Royal Army Service Corps.
I joined the Army as a boy in 47. I came onto man service in 50 and went to the Isle of Wight in the September of the 50 to do change over to maritime. By January of 51, I was on my way to Egypt.
Mick is Biff Fricker's brother, who you will hear referred to in other episodes and who will have a couple of episodes to himself later in the series. Is it right to say that you're two very different characters? I mean, Biff...
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Biff comes over really kind of, as you once said, straight as an arrow, and reading his memoirs, they're very sort of technical and very thorough. And yours read like incredible adventure stories, and I get the impression from it, correct me if I'm wrong, but between the two of you, he was kind of the good one and you were a bit of a rogue. Is that something that's fair to...
Yeah, I'm afraid that's correct, yeah. A bit of a naughty lad. My main problem was that I couldn't keep my mouth shut if I saw something wrong.
Yeah.
And most of the bullshit that went on in the army was by NCOs.
We're fortunate to have Mick still with us and living in Australia. He's a great character, so included in this recording are some of the details in his own voice. I will be releasing a full episode of our conversations in a future podcast, but for right now, these are his written memoirs. I'll start with the early memories of ships and sailors and of course the sea, which I still miss. We lived in Pitcroft Road behind St Mark's Church in North End, and sometimes you could hear the shouts and whistles of the instructors on Whale Island, then the Navy's main gunnery school. The streets of Pompey were packed with sailors then, plus of course blokes from visiting foreign ships. Most of our holidays were either spent on the beach at Southsea or a picnic on the hill, but both of them gave a terrific view of ships putting in or out of Portsmouth and the big liners from Southampton. At that age, I was only impressed with a big ship if it had 3 or more funnels. I know we went to visit the Aquitania. 4 bloody funnels! We also went on a paddle steamer to see the maiden voyage of the Queen Mary, and everyone crowded to one side to get the best view, and our mum dragged us to the other side thinking the boat was going to capsize. I can't remember the name of the paddler, but a couple of years later it was lost at Dunkirk. The next time we were to see the Mary, we were on the beach, just to the left of the South Parade Pier, when the Mary went by, and suddenly, without warning, 4 or 5 big rollers washed up the beach from her wake. There was absolute panic, deck chairs, picnic gear, buckets, spades, and quite a few kids swilling around. I don't think anyone was hurt, but a lot of gear was lost and ruined. I believe it led to a cap put on the speed of large ships in the Solent. The next big event was the declaration of war, and I remember us all sitting around the radio and old Neville Chamberlain telling us we were at war. After that, an announcer read out the list of reservists, and of course Dad's number came up. As you may know, nothing happened for nearly a year, the so-called phony war. Then all hell broke loose. The next big memory of ships was the Hood. There were groups of people gathered all over the place, all talking in hushed tones, the pride of the fleet. In fact, at that time, the biggest ship in the Navy, some 46,000 tons of battle cruiser had gone with nearly 1,500 men. There were only 3 survivors. She was a good-looking ship, but for the crew had a very poor reputation as a wet ship, and causing a lot of TB with the poor ventilation of the time. Biff and I were then evacuated. I came back to Portsmouth in 1942, just in time for some very nice air raids, and then the arrival of the Yanks. The next ship interest was the build-up for D-Day. It really is impossible to describe what the scene was like, but the Solent was packed. The harbour, Langstone, in fact every creek, spare jetty, buoy, ramps, piers built of scaffolding were jammed with vessels of every type. For years after the war there was a scaffolding jetty just to the left of South Parade until it became so rusty it was pulled down. My memories of the time leading up to D-Day are pretty confused. The streets, parks, every spare space seemed full of soldiers, trucks, guns, field kitchens, the full Monty of the Army's needs. The view from the hill was incredible. The whole Solent seemed full of landing craft, plus vessels of just about every type you could name. Then it was on. Sometimes there were explosions out at sea, but mostly it was fairly quiet, and I suppose it seems crazy, but none of us knew what was going on until the news was put out over the radio. I think Biff was still at Waltham Cross at the time. The next big event was the end of the war, and again the harbour was full of ships. I remember at one time there were 4 carriers moored in St Helens Roads, every creek full of ships slowly rusting away. Around this time the art of mothballing ships was introduced, and in fact most of the Mark 8s were found in various locks and inlets. I'm not sure of the statute of limitations on crimes of piracy, but the LCTs were mothballed with all the gear needed to go to sea, right down to knives, forks, spoons, plain cups for the peasants and posh ones for the officers. The full complement of tools, in short, everything. I hate to think how much of it was flogged and sold. I left boys' service in September 1950, and after a week or so at Aldershot, I went to the Isle of Wight to begin training as a marine engineer. We were housed in Golden Hill Fort, and most of the inshore instruction was done at Fort Victoria. The vessels were mostly moored on a trot in the river Yar, and the larger ones in the yacht moorings in the harbour. There were half a dozen harbour launches, 2 small GSIs, the Corunna and the Malta, a couple of the larger Dickens class, a 60-foot MFV, and most weeks we went out at least 3 or 4 times on day trips, and of course finished with a trip on the 1502 to the Channel Islands for booze and cheap fags. To my disgrace, I was seasick for the first time walking up the jetty in Jersey. By the January of '51 I was in Egypt, but at least I got there by the Medlock route, which was one of the best trips the Army gave me. Ferry from Harwich to the Hook of Holland, then train through Germany, Austria to Trieste in the north of Italy, then troopship to Port Said. The main camp and boat store were on the port-hand side of the canal, called Port Fouad, a mile or so from the canal, and the vessels and workshops etc. were on number 1 island, and actually formed part of the canal bank right opposite the Canal Company building. It consisted of 20 or so harbour launches, a Derby-class target tower, the Manor, 4 or 5 fast launches, and a grey class named the Grey Mist. The remainder of the company's vessels were scattered between Libya, with detachments in Tripoli, Benghazi, Derna and Tobruk, and a small detachment in Cyprus. In the canal zone there were detachments at the Bitter Lake and Suez, latter moved to Adabaya, and one at Aqaba. The last detachment was at Mombasa, which also serviced Mauritius. The island supplied men for the guard companies, which looked after the big camps and airfields and oil farms, remembering that at the time there was a massive garrison in the canal zone. One vessel I forgot was the Shepperton, a Fairmile B, 112 foot. This class were originally used by the Army as ambulance vessels, but the Shep, like several other in the Corps, were used as gin palaces for senior officers. When I first arrived in the Middle East, one of the vessels were crewed by locals wearing the uniform of the WD fleet. Mostly, we only manned the posh boats for high-ranking officers or important jobs. But in the October of '51, NASA abrogated the Canal Treaty, and almost overnight the Arab crews left, and we had to try and carry out the work. We were stretched to the limit. 24-hour days became routine. Besides the boat work, we did all the guards, cleaned the toilets, and it really was one of the toughest periods I can remember. It took a few months before the bloody bosses realised that no one could work the sort of hours on poor food and lack of sleep. Finally, we had infantry to guard the camps, and we borrowed sailors from the Royal Navy to help crew the boats. My brother Biff nearly got his head blown off whilst mounting the guard, when some overtired bloke had an accidental discharge, the muzzle blast scorching his neck. Mick would much later be awarded the General Service Medal for the Suez Zone.
Yeah, well, that's interesting, actually. I already had the General Service for Malaya, and then we got another one for Borneo. And my brother, who's still alive then, and it was almost 50 years to the day I'd left Egypt when I got the Egyptian one. It sounds crazy, but this little parcel turned up, and inside was the green and mauve medal, and so I just slung it in a drawer. I thought, oh well, because Egypt was a hell of a place to be in. You know, we had to carry weapons all the time, and there was a great deal of terrorism there.
Just before Christmas '52, we took a 60-foot MFV up to Famagusta for a really great run ashore. Anyway, in the forenoon of the first day, I was called up from the engine room to take a look at a light cruiser passing our bow at a great rate of knots. She was on her way to the Lebanese, Tripoli, to assist in the rescue of a French passenger cargo liner named the Champollion, which had gone aground and was in danger of breaking up. We just ploughed on. It would have taken us a week or more to get there. Anyway, some 40-odd years later, I meet a bloke on my local beach who was on the cruiser. It turned out it was the Kenya. She saved all the passengers and crew. He also showed me a load of black and white pictures of the rescue. The Champollion was quite famous in its time. She had one of the largest single funnels of any ship. I had seen her many times in the canal on her way to Indochina with troops of the French-Vietnam War. For my last year, I was posted in Benghazi, from where we ran a milk run to Derna and Tobruk, with some trips to Tripoli and Malta. The two MFVs in Benghazi were actually built in East Africa, in Mombasa, I think. Then back to the UK and the Isle of Wight, which had not changed. I did some upgrading courses and spent some time ashore instructing, and at least 2 spells crewing on the 1502. But by 1954, I was out to the Far East again. It was the last time I was to sail in a troop ship, as the policy came to only do air trooping, so I at least got to see Ceylon, although we did not get to run ashore there. The company was stationed on a small island a few hundred yards from Singapore Island. It consisted of the usual gaggle of shallow craft, harbour launches, GSLs, a couple of target towers, including the Armentières. There were also half a dozen RPLs. These were small landing craft, but unusually built entirely from timber. They were used mostly as ferries between us and the mainland. The main vessels were the 3 Mark IV LCTs. The Army had called them ADCs, which stood for Army Dumping Craft, or Ammunition Dumping Craft. And a great deal of my time was spent out at the deep water dumping grounds, just drifting whilst hordes of local labour dumped the stuff off the lowered ramp. Bombs, shells, radios, sewing machines, in fact anything you can think of, any type of gear the Army might use, and I'll lay a bet we put it over the wall. Most of the gear was brand new, often a later and better type than the one we actually had in service. I have vivid memories of being at the dumping grounds and watching complete airplanes being dumped from a carrier. Although the Malay War was at its height, I saw very little of it. We plodded up and down the Malay coast, dropping off supplies to various units. Only 2 incidents stick out. We took part in a massive anti-terror move off the coast of Malaya. First the Navy shelled the coast for a couple of hours, then the Royal Australian Air Force bombed the living daylights out of the trees, then land units, infantry and police field forces went in, and of course we had a front row seat for all the action, although I heard that they didn't kill or catch a single terrorist. The whole operation took some few days, and the last job we had to do was to pick up an infantry patrol from a jungle beach. We got there ahead of time, beached, had a swim and just loitered around until they turned up. Finally we saw some movement in the scrub, and out came the patrol, all trying to look like battle-hardened veterans, most of them national servicemen, about 18 years old, and imagine to our shock, trotting along behind them, an old Indian and 2 young lads to keep them supplied with tea. When I thought about it, I thought, why not? In those days the bloody army did very little for the comfort of the squaddies. It was during this period, 1957 to 58, that Mick witnessed something that was the stuff of nightmares for people living at the time of the Cold War.
I was on leave in Singapore, and we were doing a lot of shifting cargo that was going to Christmas Island. Not the Christmas Island on the west of Australia, but the Christmas Island on the east of Australia. And anyway, I got hold of a mate and managed to get I forget the word they used for it, but I went up on the Surprise, and they were Britain's first H-bomb test, and we witnessed one from, I think we would have been something like 20 miles away from it, and we turned our backs and closed our eyes, and you still saw the flash. It was an ugly scene, and I've met people who've been back there to clean up afterwards, and it did a lot of things, you know. Turtles bred there, and when they came out of the sand, they turned inland instead of going into the sea. All sorts of weird things happened to the fish, marine life. I don't know if the people that Britain moved off it have been allowed back on, but we saw the great mushroom cloud and all that stuff.
Wow, I bet that was pretty intense.
Oh God, yeah. You know, you can see it on the news and all that sort of stuff, and you realise how terrible it is. I mean, just recently, we've had a program on here about the progression of atomic weapons, and the Russians actually set one off that's something like 500 times the first one struck on Nagasaki and the others. You know, it's appalling what they can do.
I then got posted to the island of Penang. This was a doddle of a job, mainly swimming trips and that sort of thing. At this time, the Malay mainland had been declared as white and black areas. The blacks deemed a bit chancy for terrorist attacks, the white no problem. In fact, we did not even carry arms in the white areas. The job was so good that it didn't feel like work. I could skive off for the day. The Malay lads would cover for me. Corporal Fricker? Him go to store. POL office. Whatever. And of course, I would do the same for them. So as I said, it was a good job, but even the best of things have got a rotten side. We were given a job to go to a creek some 30 miles north of Penang. We arrived at the entrance of a small creek, and after about half a mile we saw a small rough jetty with a few Gurkhas lounging with a billy of tea. We still did not know why we were there. Then up came a white officer and said, "She's over there." She turned out to be the body of a young Chinese terrorist. She was lying on a rough bamboo litter covered by a ground sheet. One of the Gurkhas reclaimed the ground sheet, and to my horror, the poor little bitch had been almost cut in half at close range by a shotgun blast. We put her on the foredeck of the GSL, which was Uriah Heap, and took her back to Butterworth. We scrubbed the deck with just about every form of soap and disinfectant, but when I was posted back to Singapore a few months later, the stain was still there. I found out later the reason for taking the body in was to facilitate positive ID. There were grisly stories of hands or even heads taken for ID purposes, and there had been international complaints. Strange really, because there had been no complaints about the terrorist atrocities. I finished the last year in Singapore working on the ADCs. Just a few months before I was due to leave for the UK, I began to get strange letters from my mother. She always walked the dog through the old ordnance depot at Hilsea, and she kept saying that she saw lots of different military vehicles painted yellow. I thought the old girl was going potty, but of course we had no idea of the invasion of Suez. It was an eerie feeling to have a war between us and home, but it was a short-lived fiasco thanks to our Yankee friends. The invasion had at least given the water transport a new lease of life, as we were given the Mark 8 landing craft. I arrived back in the UK from Malaya in the middle of 1957, and after leave was posted back to the Isle of Wight, which had not changed a bit, except I was supposed to teach the layout, etc. of the, to us, new Mark 8s, and the only one I had seen had sailed past Fort Victoria. In fact, none of the instructors had. We had a few drawings and the Admiralty book on them, which meant a lot of retraining, but a great deal more sea time. In fact, we were doing more time at sea than the bloody minesweepers stationed next door to us at HMS Vernon. Except for Gun Wharf, we had no real HQ in Portsmouth, and for some time we were shunted all over the place, including a spell at Southsea Castle. Finally we were given St George's Barracks in Gosport. My job didn't last long because I was posted to Helensburgh near the entrance of the Clyde, from where we carried rockets and crews. The range was on the island of Benbecula, and the rockets were fired out over the island of St Kilda, about 80 miles out into the Atlantic. On St Kilda was a radar station and a few other bits of military stuff, but most of the year we could only work there in the summer, due to the weather, which most of the time was terrible and the rest of the time downright appalling. In fact, some of the worst I've ever experienced.
Well, we actually got back into what's called the Minch, and the wind was so strong. Mark 8 was very shallow draft, but quite high, lot of windage, and the skipper couldn't turn the ship around. And what they did in the end, they sent a destroyer up who cut circles round our backside, and he managed to get the ship around. But yeah, it was a really, I'm not sure of this exactly, but I think Mark 8s were limited to a force 4 going to sea. They weren't really sea-going ships, although they were built to fight the Japanese, and they never came about, so they were all mothballed. But they weren't great sea boats, I'm afraid.
The island of St Kilda was very small, with the remains of the island as crofts and a small graveyard. The people had been removed twice, once in the 1800s and finally in the 1920s. There had only been a few dozen of them, and there was a lot of inbreeding and some strange customs. The island also has several bits of nature that is not found anywhere else in the UK, including a type of sheep and a butterfly. There are a couple of other things, plants I think. Anyway, the place is protected, and we had to be very careful not to carry any rats there, or even the ship's cat. The rockets of the time were called the Corporal, and from what I saw of them, it's lucky we never had to take them to war. The most famous incident was the destruction of the Nafi. We had complained to the gunners that we did all the dirty work getting them and their equipment there, and they had all the fun of blasting things into space and sea. Anyway, a group of us were invited up to the range, and one of the crew had the honour of pressing the firing button. The damn thing ignited, took off from the mobile launcher, only gained a few feet, zigzagged across the moorland and smack into the canteen. Luckily the place was empty, and the rockets didn't carry an explosive warhead. My luck changed though. We damaged the ship's bottom and went into the Clyde for repairs, which gave me time to really learn the systems of the vessel I was supposed to be an expert on. We also did a lot of operations in Norway, which was the Marines area if the Ruskies had gone to war. It's true that I'd never done so much sea time in the previous few years. During the next couple of years, we had become 20 Maritime Regiment, and we really did become seagoing soldiers. It is true that we did more sea time than the Navy. Most weekends we would be putting out of Portsmouth, and there were mine hunters from HMS Vernon nicely tied up. During this time there were several bad incidents involving LCTs, but the two worst incidents are these. The 4002 beached somewhere in the West Country, and the small-time offender was given the job of cleaning the steering gear. Anyway, he chose to use petrol, and in the corner of the flat was the domestic boiler, which was a drip-feed diesel job. The resulting explosion drove the vessel several yards up the beach and opened up the complete stern like a giant tulip. The poor lad was burnt on 90% of his body and died on the way to hospital. Only one good thing that came out of it. The jerry cans were stored in racks on the upper deck with a quick release which dumped them overboard if needed. The other bad incident was when several vessels were sent to Germany, and in thick fog while crossing the entrance to the Scheldt, the leading one rammed a small Dutch coaster, which was loaded to the gills with scrap metal. It rolled over and sank in seconds, and one of the crew was trapped below and drowned. This incident cost the colonel his job, and several officers had loss of promotion, which in military terms means the end of their careers. In late '59 I was posted ashore to St George Barracks as an instructor, which was a very cushy job. Except for the odd duty, it was a 9 to 5 number with the odd training trip to replenish the duty-free supplies. Very nice, or so I thought. Then Northern Ireland broke out, and I was back. We were among the first to be sent. At the start it was okay. We had a couple of runs ashore without any trouble, but that rapidly changed, and most of us never went ashore without an armed escort. In fact, I always stayed aboard. It was just too damn dangerous. We had one really good memory of the place. We were moored at the Harland and Wolff's yard, and I walked all over the slipway on which the Titanic was built. The main reason we were in the place was to rush all the Humber pigs, a form of lightly armoured troop carrier, back to the UK for extra armour to be put on. It was found that even rifle fire would penetrate them. For a few months I went back to instructing, and I was actually walking along Weevil Lane in Gosport, and some clerk came dashing up to tell me I was wanted in the office pronto. Anyway, 8 days later I was in North Borneo. 6 senior NCOs were sent, simply because with the advent of the Mark 8s, there were just no junior ranks with small boat experience. After flying all over what was then British North Borneo, I landed at a little town called Tawau, and it was some experience. I climbed out of one plane, and in the next bay they were unloading full body bags. The Malay regiment had been ambushed at a timber camp a few miles upriver at a place named Calabacan. I slung my kit in the camp, which was right next to the airstrip, and walked down to the town jetty. And there, to my great surprise, was the Uriah Heep. And to my much greater surprise, lounging in the wheelhouse, was a bloke I had known years before in Egypt, Jackie Phillips. We cracked open a couple of cold beers and got round to finding out what the job there consisted of, and the main run was to Calabacan. I was lucky that this was my third trip to the Far East, and except for a couple of young blokes, I knew most of the Malay lads and could speak enough Malay to make a fair conversation. And there were people I'd always got on well with, and I also liked the food. The detachment consisted of the Heap and 3 harbour launches. The main job was to supply the various units scattered over the very wide area, some of coastline but mostly of rivers and a massive area of swampland, which was called the Complex, because after each big rain in Borneo, nearly every day, the rivers through the swamp changed course. The actual border between us and the Indonesians was roughly 1,500 miles long, and the British and Commonwealth troops were spread pretty thin. But after the Calabacan ambush, which was carried out by the Indian Marines, they never had any other success. To give you some idea, we covered an area about the size of Hampshire, including the Solent and the Isle of Wight, with a so-called brigade, which in fact consisted of about a decent battalion with a handful of helicopters and a battery of field guns. After a couple of months, the poor old heap was taken over by the Marines, with us as crew. We actually had number 1 SBS, the Marines copy of the SAS, with which I really got down to some active service. We got involved in all sorts of nasty tricks that people like them are trained for. The reason for it was that the government said basically it was not a war. Indonesia called it a confrontation, and we were not allowed to fire unless fired upon, and strictly not to fire over the border under any conditions. A little like Northern Ireland. The poor bloody squaddies' hands were tied. Of course, the Indians took full advantage of the situation and would shoot, rape and murder without compunction, hence the use of people like the SAS and the SBS. I've forgotten the name of the island just off Tower, but half of it was Indian and the other half ours, and we mainly operated there. We would lay up during the day, just routine maintenance, clean weapons, eat, and then after dark, the bootnecks would slip off in their full-bots and do the dirty deeds that kept the Indians in a state of apprehension, if not downright fear. I had a couple of small adventures. The first was so funny I think it's worth telling. One morning I went with a colour sergeant, one of the section leaders of the Marines, to get rations and ammo, and we took an assault boat. These were about 18-footers with a large outboard capable of 30-odd knots. We had to go to a timber camp at the end of the island, about a 2-hour trip. Anyway, we did all the routines and had a couple of beers in the mess tent, and then decided to poodle back at about 1/3 speed so that all the routine work on the heap had been done and the evening meal prepared. It was really a super day. We were about a mile off the island and about 4 or 5 miles from the mainland, and perhaps you know the strange swell you get when a large river pours into an incoming tide, and there we were, lazily swaying over it, just gassing to each other and having a fag. I was sitting on the quarter-deck of the boat, and Colin, the Marine, was standing steering with the tiller between his knees. He had his SLR propped up beside him, and I had a submachine gun on my knees. Although there was not a soul about, you had to be careful. The Indians got up to all kinds of stunts, including lying in the bilges of small fishing boats to try and slip over the border. Anyway, there we were, relaxed, ready for a meal, full of the joys of spring, and while I was talking to Colin, suddenly his mouth dropped open. It was the first time I had seen shock and fear on a bloke's face. I looked forward and I felt the same thing, all the real feelings, hair on the back of my neck, the icy clutching around my heart, clammy sweat not caused by the climate. Coming towards us about 100 yards ahead was a great sea monster, about 15 yards long, maybe half a yard wide, and coloured white, pink and black and brown in patches. It took about 10 seconds before we realised that what we were looking at was a line of wild pigs. They swim with their noses right up the stern of the pig ahead. Anyway, we circled them, and the leader was a great old boar with great tusks. The idea we had was to lop off his head with a machete, put it on an ant's nest to clean it up, and keep the skull as a souvenir, so I put a round into him. But he was so damn big, the pair of us could not lift him onto the boat. The pigs, meanwhile, had just carried on swimming towards the mainland as if nothing had happened. The unusual thing about the pigs was that they just trot over the mangrove swamps, and if we went on them, we would sink up to our thighs. The other small adventure perhaps worth telling was the great banded crate hunt. The banded crate is a denizen of the mangroves. It's a nocturnal snake and spends the day in the branches of the mangrove, but it does not coil, it flakes like a rope between a couple of thin branches. They grow to about 1 metre long and are quite poisonous. The idea was to kill them, skin them, and wear the skin around the jungle hat. Very macho. We set off in an assault boat, but paddling, the skill of the hunter, you see. Around us were lots of leads, small creeks and run-offs, which were like green tunnels with the sunlight filtering through the branches. After a couple of hours, we spotted one above us, between a couple of thin branches, fast asleep. A young marine swung a machete, and the branches and snake fell into the boat, but the bloody thing woke up in a foul mood, hissing and looking for trouble. Without a pause, another of the marines put 6 shots through the snake, and of course through the bottom of the boat, which gracefully sank, full of weapons, ammo, radios, rations, the full Monty. Assault boats were double-bottomed, so it floated, just not with us in it, and we had to push it 3 or 4 miles back through the stinking swamp, often up to our necks, cursing the young marine all the way. But in fact I remember the times with great affection. I was young and fit, and you just did not give a stuff. Everything had its fun side. I completed a year in Toa, and then it was back to Palua Brownie, and on the Marcates, and spent the next 2 years constantly on the move to all parts of North Borneo, Labuan, Brunei, Sarawak and Sabah. We also did a few trips to Thailand to take gear to build an airfield, which was used by the Yanks during the Vietnam War. I think I should have mentioned before, but the landing craft in the Far East were armed, and I'm not sure, but I think they were the first army craft to be armed, except for personal weapons. Anyway, we had 3 Zebars, 1 right forward over the doors, and 2 either side of the bridge deck. And I think they must have raided a bloody museum, because they also fitted Oerlikons. Not that it mattered, they would never fired in anger. We also did several trips from Singapore to Bahrain in the Gulf. Because of the lack of range, we had to go via the Maldives and refuel at the RAF base on the island of Gan. While in the Gulf, we did some exercises with the Yanks and the Iranians, then still under the Shah, and the general feeling was that the soldiers and sailors we came across were a pretty poor lot, badly fed, led and treated, and I wasn't surprised when the revolution came and the Shah got the elbow. The biggest impression I got from the Gulf was money. Some of the locals actually had the windscreen of their cars prescripted, so the vain bastards did not need to wear specs. The only money to come the squaddies' way was one of the LCTs moved a load of racehorses for the Sultan, and every man jack of the crew was given a top-of-the-line Rolex. The 2 officers got theirs in solid gold, and they were handed out like they were peanuts. My last few years in the army were spent mainly in Gosport, sometimes at sea, and another short spell ashore instructing. I was demobbed in 1972, and my last contact with the army, after I had been out for a couple of weeks, was a nice letter stating that after some thoughts, although I had been discharged with an exemplary record, I would not be granted the Long Service and Good Conduct Medal because of some infraction in my youth. You have just listened to the memoirs of Sergeant Mick Fricker. Please visit the Mosquito Nautica Facebook, Twitter or Instagram pages for photos and links to more information and additional material. This is all very new and still growing, so any feedback or questions are more than welcome. Thanks for listening, and please subscribe so you don't miss out on hearing more stories from the men who served under the crossed swords.